very honored to be here, and thanks for the organizers for organizing this important webinar. So for me today, really, I hope to bring about the discussion on the framing again. Brendan mentioned the framing is very important. I know people are keeping an eye on what's happening on Gaza, but they're not understanding it as maybe like a broader in the broader light of Zionism and its project in Palestine, and I want to be able to do that. And so I titled my presentation Demystifying Palestine, because I think there is, unfortunately, a tendency to complicate Palestine and what's going on in Palestine, and I think that's very dangerous. In fact, it's quite simple, and I hope to simplify it in my presentation today. I must also just note that when I mention students or educators, I actually use those simultaneously. We're all learning and we're all teaching others in many other ways. So I just want to flag that. If I do mention those, that, I'm not, obviously, I'm still a student myself and I learn every day, whether from organizations, whether from my work, and whether from what's going on in the ground. So in a way, I would like to just mention maybe like the key issue I find, at least in my experience, in academia, like let's say maybe in Ireland more specifically, about teaching Palestine, which is, how it's really framed. And too often Palestine is presented as maybe a conflict or a humanitarian crisis or religious conflict or a geopolitical stalemate. And I think this is just simply a misdiagnosis. Obviously, we have people that mention apartheid here, and they mention genocide, and they mention, the wall, or they mention the Nakba, or they mention specific symptoms. And I think it's very important to differentiate the symptoms from the cause. So I think one of the issues I see is the people, titling it, oh, this is a case of apartheid, this is a case of just, ethnic cleansing alone. And I think it's very important to tell that, this all really kind of is a symptom of one thing, which is settler colonialism. I think one common identification that is used is Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think at this stage in time, in academics as well, educators and teachers should refrain from using that and should use things like Israeli settler colonial erasure, Israeli settler colonialism, Israeli settler colonial apartheid would be more suitable definitions. And in the next slide here, I think one thing that Brendan said so beautifully is that this is a process. It has not ended. I think there's a mistake here that people mention when they mention colonialism. They sort of put it, they only focus on the Nakba, and that afterwards, that the settler colonial project, just kind of somehow just manifested into a state, and that's become a legal state and a legal body. So the project has such ended, and also just limited really for the occupied Palestinian territory in legal terms and international law terms, which is the 1967 border of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. So this is very, very problematic framing. Again, settler colonialism in this context actually manifested as really a process of bringing new settlers. So they had to continuously incentivize those, whether with birthright, promises of security, or eternal home for the Jewish people, and exclusivity of a Jewish homeland. So they needed to, and this process is continuous, and it happens all the time. And that leads to the expansion of settlements. That leads again to another, process of settler colonialism and the continuation of settler colonialism, which is also the displacement of Palestinians. And how does that really happen? It happens through genocide, apartheid, and other coercive environment tactics. And again, I must use Patrick Wolf's, a very famous quote, which is, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. So it's very important to not focus on certain events and to focus on it as a structure. I think educators need to focus on it as a structure. And when speaking about genocide, they need to relate it as a part and parcel of colonial erasure. The next thing really that I suppose I've become really passionate about lately is to speak about anti-Palestinian racism. And I think to really understand Palestine at the moment, right now, we have to look at how people were kept away from seeing what's happening for decades. We're talking about anti-Palestinian racism, but also anti-Arab racism, Orientalism, Islamophobia, etc., that are dominant in Western culture, media, and academia, etc. So even in a country very supportive of Palestine, in Ireland, even Brendan mentioned this. The media is an obvious note here, obvious actor here. So we have seen RTE, that Brendan very well mentioned. They use all the time Hamas-run health ministry. How many times have we heard them talk to Zionist reps and ambassador, occupational forces, IDF spokesperson, former prime ministers, etc.? How often have we seen them report Palestinians as passively dead or they were just killed, passively? Obviously, this is not just an RTE thing, this is just generally in media, but even in Ireland, this has been the case, unfortunately. So the pursuit is, again, of balance that Brennan has been speaking about, often meant really platforming Israeli government spokespeople alongside Palestinian victims as if the perspective is somehow symmetrical, right? So again, like this idea of balancing both sidism that is very problematic, but it also exposed, why there is some form of exceptionalism here, right? So we've seen the contrast with the coverage of Ukraine. We've seen Ukrainian resistance as portrayed as heroic, and we've seen their suffering personalized. We've seen the solidarity with them unquestioned, and I mean by governments more essentially, more importantly. But also we've seen how Palestinian resistance on the other side is criminalized, and the death as well reported passively, etc. So we can see that there is some form of racist hierarchy, whose lives and struggles are deemed legitimate, but also whose lives are worthy of saving. This is an important concept for educators to talk about, which is the concept of necropolitics, right? This idea of the power to decide who gets to live and who gets to die. This is so prominent right now. We've seen it in Palestine with governments deciding which lives are worthy of saving, which lives are worthy of living. So students should be, taught to really read this critically. And we can actually equip them as educators with the tools to do so, not just for Palestine, but generally to be honest, just stay sane really in this world. We were seeing the world really become a very volatile and violent and very confusing. So it's very important for students to be equipped with that knowledge, with these concepts and how they live and how they materialize in reality. And Palestine becomes such a very prominent, in your face example of those concepts. Here I'm using the lovely Visualizing Palestine map, and I've used it many times in my teachings, and I think like they have probably the best like visual kind of examples of what's going on in reality. So just these type of sources are quite very deep and important. And I do want educators to go deeper and look into Zionism as a settler colonial ideology. And I think this is something that I see is like an issue here, is that people kind of see it in isolation, that they see Israel, Zionism, and settler colonialism. They don't really merge those together, and I think it's very important to not just look at Israeli policies, but also look at Zionism as an ideology. What does it mean to have Zionism? What does this logic of racial supremacy and right to colonize mean in this context? And then the fact that there's this forceful kind of this idea that, Israel is not simply a state. It's just has gone too far. It has gone too far, and it's just, yes, it's founded on Jewish exclusivity, but it can be reformed in some ways or the other. I think these ideas need to be interrogated. These ideas need to be critiqued. Can we reform Zionism? Can we work through Zionism? And this opens the door to even what Brendan was talking about, the anti-Zionism as well. We've seen it being conflated right now with anti-Semitism. We're seeing how speech is curtailed, and anti-Zionism is painted as violent position, an anti-Semitic position. And it's very important for these type of conversations to happen. How does freedom of speech, academic freedom, is curtailed through this type of lens? We've seen in the Irish context the adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. These things need to be discussed in classrooms. And I think one thing that I would like maybe to mention to educators is that Palestine is not just simply a context. It's not simply an example you can give to things. I think it's a lens. You need to be able to use Palestine as a lens. So, I believe that Palestine belongs to, several subjects. In fact, we can see Palestine in geography, environmental studies. Palestine offers a clear example of an environmental apartheid, environmental colonialism, where access to land, water, agriculture, natural resources is racialized and weaponized. We see the environmental destruction of Gaza, right? We see ecocide, and we see this being talked about all the time. What's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Gaza's environment. So you can even use that in classes where you're talking about the environment if you're doing environmental studies. Literature and language, we have ample Palestinian poetry, memoirs, fiction, oral history that offers, really emotional, powerful, and politically rich materials. We have Ghassan Kanafani, Suzanne Abu Hawa, Mahmoud Darwish. We have many, many more. Arts and culture, we see this also more prominent. We see embroidery, graffiti. I know this in the north as well, the north of Ireland. We have these types of graffiti as well that is used as a space to as a political space, really, an expression of identity. How can students learn about these parallels of using art as an expression of resistance? So, and many other, obviously, many other ways that we can use Palestine in different courses, in different classrooms. It doesn't have to be just politics and international law and history, etc. But when it comes to history, it's still very important to note that it's easy to be in a history class and just draw parallels. For example, I put this example because we're speaking from an Irish context, and a lot of our educators here today are working in Irish context. We see the famine, and the famine in Gaza, right? The Irish famine, the famine in Gaza. How can we understand that? How can we understand the fact that it's simply not just a passive famine, that there is a cause for that famine, that there are perpetrators, etc. The last thing I would just like and to invite educators to do is to look at what meaningful solidarity looks like. Once you understand that Zionism is a settler colonial ideology based on the displacement and replacement of Palestinians, what does justice look like afterwards? Obviously, when Brandon was speaking about conflict and peace building, it was the prominent answer we were given all the time is I believe in the one state solution, I believe in the two state solution, let's implement dialogue projects, etc., etc. But unfortunately, what we missed here is the first, there has been a misdiagnosis. Second, because of this misdiagnosis, the application and the solutions that are applied, or again, the fact that they're applied at all without even providing the Palestinians with the right to self-determination, is very problematic. So what does meaningful solidarity look like, right? We see in Ireland, students should, be able to look at their governments and be aware of the complicity of their governments. We have Cannon Airport being used to transport U.S. arms and aid in the military-industrial complex that arms Israel. We have here a picture of Michal Martin, the prime minister, who's, looking at the ceiling, an Israeli ceiling, and pointing at it. And obviously for Michal Martin, that's not the same expression and that he uses against Palestinians that are massacred, and his interest does not lie in that. So maybe it's important to look at what students can learn from their government's positions. How can they partake in the political environment they are in? The fact that there is a form of depoliticization, unfortunately, is very problematic. It's the people and students and people just generally, they are electing these people, and they should be participating in the process of the political process and the decisions made by these governments. So it's important, that this is not about inducing guilt. It's about creating a space for responsibility, agency, and meaningful action. So teaching Palestine is not just about teaching a faraway place, it's about confronting how empire works, how racism hides in plain sight, how injustice is rationalized through language, but also how solidarity can be built through education. So Palestine, again, is not an exception. It's a window into the world we live in. So we must use Palestine as the lens. We must frame the situation correctly. We must be brave. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.